Hey guys, in this month's Historical Fiction 101, I'm going to be sharing with you some recommendations for Jane Eyre retellings. So last year I did a video pretty similar to this one where I did like Pride and Prejudice retellings, either Pride and Prejudice retellings that were downright retellings or they were extensions of that world. So yeah, that's what this video is going to be. It's going to be books that are either straight up retellings, like the plots of what's going on, or things that are extensions, but yeah, all still historical fiction. So yeah, no modern retellings in this list. And yeah, I consider Jane Eyre to be one of my favorite classics. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I love the story of Jane Eyre. I love the, which adaptation is that? The 2006 adaptation, I think is what it is. It had Toby Stephens and Ruth Wilson. I love that adaptation. One of my top favorites, you guys. Oh, Toby Stephens, yes. And while I'm doing this video giving you the recommendations, I'm going to be looking down here at my computer screen. If you're wondering what I'm sitting here looking down at, I'm going to be looking down at the Goodreads synopsises for all of these books. And yeah, right now, now's your time to pull up your own Goodreads if any of these books sound like something you want to read in the future. So let's get going. First up, The Hour of Fatality, a Jane Rochester mystery by Leanne McKinley. Jane Eyre's story continues with a mysterious rumor and a dangerous secret. Jane is married at last to Mr. Rochester. I guess spoilers if you've not read Jane Eyre, dear God, it's just going right into it. Jane is married at last to Mr. Rochester, but with Thornfield Hall destroyed by fire, they have no home to go to except Ferndean Manor. To Jane, it is the perfect escape for a storm-tossed couple, but it does not hide them from the wings of trouble. Mr. Rochester's faithful land agent has disappeared with nothing but a letter as an explanation. Why did he depart so quickly from Thornfield? Local tales abound regarding Thornfield Hall, but Jane is unable to investigate when she is struck down by typhoid fever, dear God. With the aid of Diana Rivers, they flee illness to Ingram Park, only to find a far more deadly mystery waiting for them. A hidden disaster lies in wait for the Ingram household, and Jane must rely on her own abilities and on the long experience of Mr. Rochester to uncover the truth. And yeah, this is part of a series. I'm kind of surprised this isn't part of a series. It looks like it's just one and done book. Next up, this is a classic when it comes to Jane Eyre retellings, and this is Wide Sargasso? You know, how do you pronounce this? I have never figured out how to pronounce this. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Born into an oppressive colonialist society, Creole heiress Antoinette Causeway meets a young Englishman who is drawn to her innocent sensuality and beauty. After their marriage, disturbing rumors begin to circulate, poisoning her husband against her. Caught between his demands and her own precarious sense of belonging, Antoinette is driven towards madness. And so yeah, this is a retelling of like kind of the prequel to what happens to Jane Eyre, it sounds like, how Mr. Rochester meets his very first wife. A spoiler, once again, spoilers, I guess. This book is like hundreds of years old at this point. So yeah, how Mr. Rochester meets his first wife, and I guess how she becomes the mad woman in the attic. Next up, My Plain Jane by Cynthia Hand, and this is actually book 2 in this particular series, where this author takes like characters named Jane and does like a retelling of them. So yeah, this particular book is like a Jane Eyre retelling, obviously, or else it wouldn't be on this list. You may think you know the story. After a miserable childhood, penniless orphan Jane Eyre embarks on a new life as a governess at Thornfield Hall. Then she meets one dark, brooding Mr. Rochester. Despite their significant age gap and his uneven temper, they fall in love, and reader, she marries him. Or does she? Prepare for an adventure of Gothic proportions, in which all is not as it seems. A certain gentleman is hiding more than skeletons in his closet, and one orphan Jane Eyre, aspiring author Charlotte Bronte, and supernatural investigator Alexander Blackwood are about to be drawn together on the most epic ghost hunt this side of Wuthering Heights. Next up, I have a silly one here. I kind of just threw it in here just because it's silly, and I have read this book, you guys. I wish I never read this book because it was kind of not that great. But yeah, I did indeed read this. Jane Slayer, the literary classic with a blood-sucking twist by Charlotte Bronte, in a sense. This book is kind of done in the tradition of what was done with Pride and Prejudice and zombies, but in this, it's like, what if Jane Eyre is like a vampire slayer, essentially. Jane Slayer, our plucky demon-slaying heroine, a courageous orphan who spurns the detestable vampire kin who raised her, sets out on the adventure of her ghostly uncle to hone her skills as the fearless slayer she's meant to be. When she takes a job as governess at a country estate, she falls head over heels for her new master, Mr. Rochester, only to discover he's hiding a violent werewolf in the attic in the form of his first wife. Can a menagerie of bloodthirsty, flesh-eating, savage creatures of the night keep a swashbuckling 19th century lady from the gentleman she intends to marry? Vampires, zombies, and werewolves transform Charlotte Bronte's unforgettable masterpiece into an eerie, paranormal adventure that will delight and terrify. Like I said, I did read this horrible piece of trash, but it's on the list because it is a Jane Eyre retelling. It's like this book came out because during this time period, like I said, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies had come out, and Pride and Prejudice and Zombies was so wildly popular. So it was kind of during this time period that a lot of people were just taking classics left and right and doing whatever the hell they wanted with them. And yeah, for the most part, none of them were good. It's like you can't top Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Next up, A Breath of Air by Eve Marie Mont, and it looks like this is some sort of series as well. It looks like this book is about a modern day woman who like somehow time travels to the era of Jane Eyre, it looks like. So yeah, we follow a young woman named Emma Townsend. Emma Townsend has always believed in stories, the ones she reads voraciously and the ones she creates. Perhaps it's because she feels like an outsider at her exclusive prep school, or because her stepmother doesn't come close to filling the void left by her mother's death. And her only romantic prospect, apart from a crush on her English teacher, is Gray Newman, a longtime friend who just adds to Emma's confusion, but escape soon arrives in an old leather-bound copy of Jane Eyre. Reading of Jane's isolation sparks a deep sense of kinship. Then fate takes things a leap further when a lightning storm catapults Emma right into Jane's body and her 19th century world. As governess at Thornfield, Emma has a sense of belonging she's never known and an attraction to the brooding Mr. Rochester. Now, moving between her two realities and uncovering secrets in both, Emma must decide whether her destiny lies in the pages of Jane's story or in the unwritten chapters of her own. Yeah, like I said, kind of a bit of a time-traveling twist with this narrative, but still kind of going into a historical setting with Jane Eyre at times. Next up, Mr. Rochester by Sarah Shoemaker. I do own this book, but I have yet to read it. I can't wait to get to this book. So with this retelling, we have Edward, who is a vulnerable, brilliant, complicated man, whom we first meet as a motherless, lonely little boy roaming the corridors and stable yards of Thornfield Hall. On the morning of Edward's 8th birthday, his father issues a decree. He is to be sent away to get an education, exiled from Thornfield and all he ever loved. As the determined young Edward begins his journey across England, making friends and enemies along the way, a series of eccentric mentors teach him more than he might have wished about the ways of the men and women who will someday be his peers. But much as he longs to be accepted and to return to the home where he was born, his father has made clear that Thornfield is reserved for his older brother, Roland, and that Edward's inheritance lies instead on the warm, languid shores of faraway Jamaica. That island, however, hides secrets of its own, and not long after his arrival, Edward finds himself entangled in morally dubious business dealings and a passionate whirlwind love affair with the town's ravishing heiress, Antoinetta Bertha Mason. Eventually, after a devastating betrayal, Edward must return to England with his increasingly unstable wife to take over as master of Thornfield, and it's here on a twilight ride that he meets the stubborn, plain young governess who will teach him how to love again. Ooh. So yeah, we're getting a lot of backstory to Mr. Rochester and eventually leading up to Jane Eyre, yes. Next up, Jane Eyre's Daughter by Elizabeth Newark. I guess that's pretty self-explanatory. A passionate young woman of high courage, in this sequel to Jane Eyre, young Janet Rochester is consigned to Highcrest Manor and the guardianship of the strict Colonel Dent, while her parents journey to the West Indies. As Janet struggles to make a life for herself, guided by the ideals of her parents, she finds herself caught up in the mysteries of Highcrest. Why is the East Wing forbidden to her? What lies behind locked gates? And what is the source of voices she hears in the night? Can she trust the enigmatic Roderick Landless, or should she transfer her allegiances to the suave and charming Sir Hugo Calendar? Whether riding her mare on the Yorkshire moors, holding her own with Colonel Dent, or waltzing at her first ball, Janet is strong, sympathetic, and courageous. After all, she is her mother's daughter. Next up, Death of a Schoolgirl, and this is book 1 in this particular series. I have read and reviewed this very first book in the series. I never got into the rest of it. I don't know why, because I actually really liked this first book. It was just really fun and interesting, and I liked it. I liked the continuation of Jane's story in this. And yeah, this is by Joanna Campbell Slane. The year that we're starting off with in this novel is 1851, and Jane's life has finally settled into a comfortable pattern. She and her beloved Edward Rochester have married and have an infant son, but Jane soon finds herself in the midst of new challenges and threats to those she loves. Jane can't help but fret when a letter arrives from Adele Varens, Rochester's ward and Jane's former pupil, currently at boarding school, warning that the girl's life is in jeopardy. Although it means leaving her young son and invalid husband, and despite never having been to a city of any size, Jane feels strongly compelled to go to London to ensure Adele's safety. But almost from the beginning, her travels don't go as planned. She is knocked about and robbed, and no one believes that the plain, unassuming Jane could indeed be the wife of a gentleman. Even when she arrives at the school, the headmistress takes her for an errant new teacher and berates her for her late arrival. Most shocking to Jane is the discovery that Adele's roommate has recently passed away under suspicious circumstances, yet no one at the school seems concerned. Taking advantage of the misunderstanding, she decides to pose as the missing instructor, and soon uncovers several unsavory secrets which may very well make her the killer's next target. Seriously, I actually really quite liked this book. It seemed like kind of this nice little continuation of Jane Eyre. It felt kind of believable to me. Next up, Thornfield Hall by Jane Stubbs. Thornfield Hall, 1821. Alice Fairfax takes up her role as housekeeper of the estate, but when Mr. Rochester presents her with a woman who is to be hidden on the 3rd floor, she finds herself responsible for much more than the house. This is a story of Jane Eyre never knew, a narrative played out on the 3rd floor and beneath the stairs as the servants kept their master's secret safe and sound. So yeah, this is like a Downton Abbey type of version of Jane Eyre. We're getting like the household servant perspective of what's going on. I like that idea. And the last book that I have here, Reader, I Murdered Him by Betsy Cornwell. And this is actually a fairly new book. It came out in November of 2022, it looks like. And we're getting the perspective of Adele in this book. I really like that. I like how a lot of these books kind of throw in Adele in there, because I think she's kind of an easy character to kind of use and to do like a retelling of. Adele grew up in the shadows, first watching from backstage at her mother's Parisian dance halls, then wandering around the gloomy haunted rooms of her father's manor. When she's finally sent away to boarding school in London, she's happy to enter the brightly lit world of society girls and their wealthy suitors. Yet there are shadows there too. Many of the men that try to charm Adele's new friends do so with dark intentions. After a violent assault, she turns to a roguish young con woman for help. Together they become vigilantes and meting out justice. But can Adele save herself from the same fate as those she protects? And yet it says this is kind of like a queer romance with Adele and this con woman, it seems like. I really like the idea of this one, because yeah, in the book Adele is a little girl, you know, she's a little girl, so it seems like she's like more of a grown woman in this, which sounds pretty cool. So you guys, that is it for my recommendations for Jane Eyre themed retellings. Like I said, either direct retellings or extensions of a sort, or just silly things like Jane's Lair. So yeah, you guys, are there any retellings of Jane Eyre that I have missed for this list? I feel like there's some random ones. Even if they're modern ones, go ahead and share some modern ones with me. I like those, because I know there's like The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. That's like a modern retelling of Jane Eyre that I really liked. Yeah, just let me know if there's any other retellings out there of Jane Eyre. So that's it for this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you like this video, you may like these other videos. Bye, guys.